His name was James Marion Sims. They called him the father of modern gynecology. His statue stood in Central Park for over a century. His face appeared on medical school walls. His name was engraved on hospital wings. His portrait hung in the halls of some of the most prestigious institutions in the world. He was lauded in France. He was celebrated in Belgium. He was honored by kings. His name was spoken with reverence in hospitals on every continent. And between 1845 and 1849, in a small wooden shed behind his house in Montgomery, Alabama, he cut open enslaved black women without anesthesia, over and over and over again. And when it was over, he published his findings. He presented them at conferences. He wrote them in careful, precise, celebrated prose. And the world gave him a standing ovation. This is not a story about that man. This is the story of the women he used. The women he never named. The women the world forgot. The women who made his triumph possible and received nothing in return. Not credit, not gratitude, not even the mercy of being remembered until now. Montgomery, Alabama, 1845. To understand what happened in that shed, you must first understand the world that built it. Alabama had been a state for only 26 years. It had been carved out of Creek and Cherokee land, territory taken by force and treaty, reshaped by the hands of enslaved people, into one of the wealthiest cotton-producing regions in the world. Cotton was king. That phrase is used so often it has lost its weight. So let us put the weight back. In 1845, cotton accounted for more than half of all American export earnings. The entire national economy and the banks, the railroads, the insurance companies, the merchant houses of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, all of it rested on a foundation of enslaved labor. All of it was built on the backs and the hands and the bodies of people who were not paid, not protected, not regarded as human beings under the law. The enslaved population of Alabama in 1845 was approximately 253,000 people, more than one-third of the state's total population. They outnumbered free white residents in many counties. They built the roads. They cleared the forests. They planted and harvested and ginned and baled the cotton. They cooked the meals. They raised the children of the families that owned them. They built everything. They owned nothing. Human beings were bought and sold at auction. In Montgomery, the capital city, the auction blocks were in the public square. Families were separated, mothers from children, husbands from wives, with the same legal indifference as the sale of a horse or a parcel of land. A plantation ledger from this period might list, on the same page, the inventory of livestock, the count of cotton bales, and the names, sometimes only the first names, of the enslaved people held as property. They were not people in the eyes of the law. They were assets. Enslaved women occupied a specific and brutal position within this system. They were workers, in the fields, in the house, in the kitchen and the nursery, but they were also, in the cold language of the slave economy, breeders. Their reproductive capacity had direct financial value. A woman who could bear children was worth more at auction than one who could not. Their pregnancies were noted in plantation records. Their deliveries were sometimes attended, sometimes not. Their health after childbirth was a matter of economic calculation, not human concern. If a woman recovered quickly and returned to labor, that was profit. If she did not, if she was sick, weakened, unable to work, that was loss. It is within this calculus that vesico-vaginal fistula becomes important. A fistula is a wound, a tear. Specifically, it is an abnormal opening, a hole, that forms between two internal structures that should be separate. In vesico-vaginal fistula, that hole opens between the bladder and the vaginal wall. It is caused most commonly by prolonged, obstructed labor. When a baby cannot pass through the birth canal, when labor stalls and the hours stretch into a full day and then 2 days, the baby's head presses continuously with enormous force against the soft tissue between the bladder and the vaginal wall. That tissue, deprived of blood flow, crushed between bone and bone, begins to die. It becomes necrotic, and when it dies, a hole opens. From that moment forward, urine passes continuously through the hole. There is no voluntary control. There is no pause, no relief, no dry moment. It is constant. It soaks through clothing. It causes the skin to break down from constant moisture and chemical exposure. It leads to chronic urinary tract infections, to kidney damage, to sepsis. Untreated, it is a slow death sentence. The odor is overwhelming and uncontrollable. Women with fistula were often isolated from their communities. They were sometimes cast out. They were regarded with shame and disgust by a world that did not understand what had happened to them. And for enslaved women in the antebellum South, the conditions that produced fistula were endemic. Women labored in fields through pregnancy. Nutrition was poor. Prenatal care was non-existent. Childbirth was attended, if at all, by other enslaved women who had learned what they knew by witnessing, not by training. Obstructed labor, labor that lasted 2 days, 3 days, was not uncommon, and fistula was the consequence. There was no surgical cure. There had never been a successful repair. Medical literature offered nothing. Physicians who attempted closure had failed universally. The condition was regarded as permanent, a life sentence. Into this world in 1845, a 32-year-old physician in Montgomery, Alabama, decided he was going to solve the problem. His name was James Marion Sims, and his solution would make him famous. James Marion Sims was born on January 25, 1813, in Lancaster County, South Carolina. He grew up in a world of cotton and hierarchy, in a family of modest means, but significant social aspiration. His father was a sheriff, a man of local standing. Sims inherited that ambition. It ran through everything he did. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, restless, driven, possessed by a need to be recognized. He wanted to leave a mark on the world. He just did not yet know what shape that mark would take. He enrolled at South Carolina College in 1830. He graduated in 1832. He then trained at the Medical College of South Carolina and completed his formal education at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, one of the most respected medical schools in America at the time. He graduated in 1835 at the age of 22. His early career was, by his own admission, unremarkable. He set up practice in Lancaster, South Carolina, and within months 2 of his patients died. He wrote later that he was so shaken by this that he considered abandoning medicine entirely. He did not. He moved instead. First to Mount Meigs, Alabama, then to Montgomery. He built a practice treating the ailments of planters and their families, the people with money, the people with standing, the people whose patronage could build a reputation. He was not poor. He was not obscure, but he was not yet what he intended to become. He was competent. He was organized. He was watching and waiting for the thing that would define him. In 1845, a plantation owner brought him a young enslaved woman. She had been in labor for 3 days. The baby had not survived, and she was now suffering from a condition the owner needed resolved. Her name was Anarcha. Anarcha was 17 years old. Let that number sit for a moment. 17. A girl, legally still a child by almost any modern standard. She had been enslaved her entire life. She had been pregnant. She had endured 72 hours of obstructed labor. She had lost her baby, and now she was leaking urine continuously, unable to control her body, in pain, frightened, and standing in the office of a white physician who looked at her and saw an opportunity. Sims had never treated a fistula. No physician had successfully repaired one. The procedure was considered impossible, but Sims believed that impossibility was simply a problem that had not yet been approached correctly. He asked Anarcha's owner for permission to keep her and attempt an experimental surgical repair. The owner agreed. Permission was not Anarcha's to give. Her consent was not sought. Her opinion was not recorded. Her fear was not documented. She was property. The decision about what happened to her body belonged to the man who owned her. Sims set up a small wooden outbuilding behind his Montgomery home. He began to collect more women. A plantation owner nearby had an enslaved woman named Betsey. She too suffered from fistula. She too was delivered to Sims for repair. Then came Lucy. Then others, women whose names Sims did not record, or recorded only partially, or recorded in a way that has since been lost. 7 women, possibly more, at various points, all of them enslaved. all of them brought to him by the men who owned them, all of them held in his shed, living and cooking and caring for one another through surgeries and recoveries and more surgeries. Sims would later write about this period in his autobiography. He described it with enthusiasm, with the energy of a man who has finally found his calling. He wrote about the problem, about the challenge, about his ingenuity. He did not write in any sustained way about the women, about what they endured, about what they felt, about who they were. In his telling, they were not subjects. They were not even patients in the full sense of that word. They were the problem, and he was the solution. Before he began operating, Sims made a discovery that he would later describe as accidental. He was treating a white woman patient who had been thrown from a horse and suffered a displacement of the uterus. He needed to examine her internally. He had her turn onto her hands and knees, and in doing so, he discovered that the position opened the vaginal canal in a way that allowed unprecedented visibility into the pelvic cavity. Air entered the cavity. The internal structures became visible. He later wrote that in that moment, he understood immediately and completely that vesico-vaginal fistula could be repaired. He picked up a pewter spoon. He bent it. He used it to hold the vaginal wall open, and he could see the fistula clearly for the first time. This improvised instrument would become, in refined form, the Sims speculum, still used in gynecological examination today, still bearing his name, still carrying the silence of where it was developed. He now had the position. He had the instrument. He had the women. The experiments began. The year was 1845. Anesthesia existed. This fact requires expansion. It requires confrontation, because one of the most common defenses of Sims, offered even today, even in medical schools, is that anesthesia was not yet available when he began his work. This is false. Ether had been used experimentally for years before Sims began operating. Crawford Long, a Georgia physician, used ether for surgery as early as 1842, 3 years before Sims's first operation on Lucy. The famous public demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1846, the one that entered the history books, took place 1 year into Sims's experiments. By the time Sims performed his later operations, anesthesia was not only available, it was standard practice for white patients undergoing surgery. Sims knew this. He was a trained practicing physician. He attended medical conferences. He read the literature. He was not operating in ignorance. He chose not to use anesthesia on these women, and the reason he chose not to was the reason that would poison American medicine for 2 centuries. It was a belief, widespread, taught, written into textbooks, that black people did not feel pain the way white people did, that their nervous systems were different, that their threshold for suffering was higher, that their bodies were, in a sense, built for endurance. There was no science behind this belief. There was never any science behind it. It was a story the slave-holding world told itself, to make the unbearable bearable, not for the enslaved people, but for those who enslaved them. If they don't feel it the way we do, then what we're doing is not cruelty. It is simply necessity. Sims held this belief. His colleagues held this belief. The physicians who stood in his shed and watched him operate held this belief, and so the operations began without mercy. The first procedure was performed on Lucy. She was positioned on the table on her hands and knees, the position Sims had discovered weeks earlier with his white patient, the position that opened the body. That made her interior visible. That made her a specimen. She was conscious. She was awake for all of it. There were other physicians in the room, observers. They watched. They took notes. They did not object. Sims operated. He cut. He inserted the modified speculum. He attempted the repair. It did not work. In the days that followed, Lucy developed a severe systemic infection. The sponge Sims had used to pack the wound, a common surgical material of the era, had been left in too long. It had introduced bacteria into an already traumatized area. The infection spread. Sims wrote about this in his autobiography. He wrote, with his characteristic clinical detachment, that Lucy had been in great agony. That phrase, great agony, written down, acknowledged, and then set aside. Because the experiment was not over. Because there were more operations to perform. Because Lucy's great agony was, in his calculus, the cost of progress. He operated on Betsey next, then on Anarcha, then on the others. Sometimes multiple women in the same session, always without anesthesia, always with an audience, always with the precision and the detachment of a man who had decided that these women were the price of discovery. The operations did not work, not at first, not for a long time. The fundamental problem was suture material. Sims was using silk sutures, the standard of the era, to close the fistula, but silk in this wet, delicate tissue did not hold. It slipped. It degraded. The repairs failed. He tried different approaches, different angles, different suture placements. Each attempt required a new operation. Each operation required positioning, cutting, probing, and inserting instruments into the bodies of women who had no power to refuse. It took 4 years. 4 years of operations. 4 years in that shed. 4 years of recovering and being operated on again. 4 years of holding their bodies still while a man cut into them and told himself he was doing good. Anarcha underwent 30 operations. 30. The number is so large it risks becoming abstract. So do not let it become abstract. 30 times Anarcha was placed on that table. 30 times instruments were inserted into her body. 30 times she was cut. 30 times she healed, or tried to heal, and was cut again. 30 times without anesthesia. 30 times without her consent. 30 times with her body treated as a research instrument, rather than the living self of a human being. She was 17 when it began. She was 21 when it ended. The 4 years of a young woman's life that should have held something else entirely. In 1849, Sims finally solved the suture problem. He switched from silk to silver wire. Silver wire, unlike silk, did not absorb bacteria. It did not slip. It held. The repair on Anarcha held. Sims declared it a success. He wrote about breakthrough, about triumph, about the gift he had given to medicine. He did not ask Anarcha what she felt. He did not record her words. He did not write her name in his published paper. He did not acknowledge, in any formal record, what 30 operations on her body had cost her. She was the instrument through which his discovery was made. And instruments do not get credit. Instruments do not get monuments. Instruments do not get named. Let us stop. Let us step away from Sims entirely. Let us step away from the instruments and the publications and the breakthrough. Let us stay with the women, because the women are the story. They are the only story. Anarcha. Her name is unusual in the records of American slavery. Most enslaved people were given simple English names. Names their enslavers chose. Names that fit easily in a ledger column. Anarcha does not fit that pattern. Medical historian Deirdre Cooper Owens has written at length about this name. She suggests it may reflect an African linguistic origin, possibly Yoruba, possibly Akan, possibly from a Twi or Fante tradition. If that is true, it means that Anarcha's name was a thread of continuity with a world that had been violently severed from her, a world across the Atlantic that she had never seen, a world whose languages and rhythms and naming traditions had survived somehow in the one syllable her parents gave her. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the name was simply what it was. We do not know. That is the point. We do not know because the records were not built to preserve her. They were built to catalogue her. And those are not the same thing. What we know about Anarcha is this. She was 17 when she first entered Sims's shed. She had been pregnant. She had endured 3 days of labor. She had lost a child. She had developed a fistula. She was operated on 30 times over 4 years, and she survived. The survival is the part that undoes me most. To survive that. 30 operations, no anesthesia, 4 years in a shed, and to survive. What does a person hold on to? What keeps a person's spirit whole? When their body is being used as a problem to be solved. We do not know. No one asked. No one recorded the answer, but she survived. And that survival is an act of will so profound that no monument built to James Marion Sims can come close to honoring it. Betsey appears in Sims's records as the second major experimental subject. Some accounts suggest she was the first operated on. The historical record is imprecise. She suffered from fistula. She was operated on multiple times. She has no last name in any document that survives. Betsey was also the woman on whom Sims first perfected his positioning technique, the hands and knees position that opened the body for examination. It is sometimes called the Sims position. His name is on that too. Betsey's body helped him discover it. Betsey's name is not attached to it. Lucy. Lucy is the woman whose suffering is most directly acknowledged in Sims' own writings. He wrote about her great agony after the first failed operation. He wrote it plainly, without flinching, as a clinical observation, and then he operated on her again. That is the thing about Lucy's story that stays with you. He knew she was in agony. He recorded it. He held that knowledge in his hands, and he cut anyway. What does it mean to see someone suffering and decide it does not change what you are about to do? It means you have decided their suffering does not count, not because you cannot see it, but because you have already determined that they are not the kind of person whose suffering creates an obligation in you. This is the logic of dehumanization, not blindness, deliberate unseeing. After Sims relocated to New York in 1853 and founded the Woman's Hospital in 1855, he performed the same procedures on white women. This is documented in his own institutional records. On those patients, he used chloroform anesthesia, the same hands, the same instruments, the same procedure, different patients, different treatment. He was not operating in a moral gray area. He knew the difference between pain and its absence. He applied that knowledge selectively, based on the race of the person on the table. That is not ambiguity. That is a choice. And then there are the unnamed women. Historians believe that at least 7 enslaved women were held in Sims's shed over the 4-year period. Some accounts suggest the number was higher. Only Anarcha, Betsey and Lucy were named in any surviving record. The others are shadows. We know they existed because Sims himself mentioned them in passing. A reference here, an unnamed case there. Women who were operated on, who recovered, who were operated on again, and whose names the historical record did not consider worth preserving. They had names. Someone gave them those names. Someone called them by those names every day. Someone knew them, and history swallowed them whole. The most dangerous question in this story is not about Sims. It is about the world that produced him, the world that trained him, the world that watched him work and did not object, the world that celebrated him. Because if this is only the story of one bad man, then we can put it away when it's over. We can file it under aberration, under exception, under a darkness we have moved past. But it is not the story of one bad man. In 1845, Alabama, the law was explicit. An enslaved person had no legal standing. They could not enter into a contract. They could not own property. They could not testify in court against a white person. They could not refuse a physician's treatment if that treatment was authorized by the person who owned them. The concept of informed consent, the bedrock of modern medical ethics, did not apply to enslaved people. It was not an oversight. It was the design. The system was built to ensure that their bodies were available for labor, for reproduction, for experimentation, for whatever a white man with authority needed them to be. Sims was not an outlier in this regard. Dr. Thomas Hamilton, practicing in Augusta, Georgia, conducted experiments on an enslaved man named John Brown to determine the limits of human heat tolerance. He placed Brown in a hole dug in the ground, surrounded by burning coal, and observed systematically, clinically, at what temperature the human body began to blister. He varied the experiment. He repeated it. He applied different substances to Brown's skin to test which offered protection. John Brown survived. He escaped to England in the 1850s. In 1855, he published his memoir, Slave Life in Georgia. In it, he described what Hamilton had done to him in precise, devastating detail. He described the heat, the blisters, the repetition, the complete indifference to his suffering. John Brown's memoir is one of the most important documents in the history of American medicine. Most medical students have never heard of it. These were not isolated incidents. Medical schools in the antebellum South relied on the bodies of enslaved people, living and dead, for instruction. Cadavers were needed for anatomy classes. When legal sources ran dry, the bodies of enslaved people were used, stolen from graves, sold by overseers, taken. Medical historian Harriet Washington documented this pattern exhaustively. In her 2006 book, Medical Apartheid, she traced the use of black bodies in American medical research from the colonial period through the 20th century. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the HeLa cells taken from Henrietta Lacks without her knowledge, the experiments on prisoners, on psychiatric patients, on the poor. Patterns that stretch unbroken from the slave shed in Montgomery to the research hospital in the 1970s. The logic never changed. Only the paperwork did. Sims published his findings in 1852. The paper appeared in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences. The title was clinical and precise, on the treatment of vesico-vaginal fistula. It is a remarkable paper in purely technical terms. The surgical description is clear. The methodology is detailed. The results are documented. Anarcha does not appear by name. Betsey does not appear by name. Lucy does not appear by name. The women appear as cases, as numbered instances, as evidence. Their names, their ages, their histories, their suffering. None of it considered relevant to the published findings. Because in the world that produced that paper, they were not people who had contributed to science. They were material that science had been performed upon. And the world that received that paper agreed. Sims left Montgomery in 1853. He left the shed. He left Alabama. He left Anarcha and Betsey and Lucy, and the unnamed women, and the 4 years of their suffering somewhere behind him. He went to New York, and the world opened its arms. By 1855, he had founded the Woman's Hospital of New York, the first institution in the United States, dedicated specifically to women's medicine. It was groundbreaking. It was celebrated. It was built on a technique developed without the women's consent. In a wooden shed in the slaveholding South, he operated on white patients in that hospital. He used anesthesia. He was meticulous. He was skilled. He was building an empire of reputation, one successful surgery at a time. New York was not enough for him. He sailed to Europe in the 1860s. He brought his instruments. He brought his technique. He brought the polish of a man who had spent a decade being called a genius by people who did not know the price of the discovery. He operated in Paris. He operated in London. He operated before audiences of European physicians, who watched his hands and marveled at his precision. He treated the Empress Eugénie of France, wife of Napoleon III. He treated the Empress of Austria. He moved through the courts of Europe as an honored guest, a healer, a visionary, a man of science. The Belgian government awarded him the Order of Leopold. The French government awarded him the Legion of Honor. He was made a corresponding member of medical societies in France, Italy, Ireland, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal. He was, without question, one of the most celebrated physicians in the history of Western medicine. He was also the president of the American Medical Association in 1876. The same year, a bronze monument was erected in his honor in Bryant Park, New York City. The monument was later moved to Central Park, placed near the Fifth Avenue entrance. In the park, where the wealthiest people in New York walked their dogs and pushed their children in prams, and looked up at his bronze face, and perhaps felt a swell of civic pride, a reminder that science flourishes here, that progress is made here, that great men come from this country. James Marion Sims died in November 1883. He died at the age of 70 in his home in New York. His obituary in the New York Times called him one of the most eminent surgeons in the world. He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. His grave is marked. His name is there, in stone, permanent. The graves of Anarcha, Betsey, and Lucy, if they have graves, are not known. Their burial sites have not been identified. Their deaths were not recorded in any document that survives. They disappeared into the same silence that had always surrounded them. The silence that the world calls forgetting. But that is not what it is. It is not forgetting. It is a choice made at every level, over and over, to not write down the name, to not mark the grave, to not consider the life worth preserving. That is not forgetting. That is erasure. And erasure is deliberate. For more than a century, the story was told only one way. Sims discovered the cure for vesico-vaginal fistula. Sims founded the Women's Hospital of New York. Sims advanced the science of gynecology. Sims deserves his statue. Sims deserves his place in the history of medicine. That story was not wrong about the facts. It was wrong about what the facts meant. It was wrong about what it left out. The challenge to that story did not come from nowhere. It came from a generation of scholars, most of them black women, who decided that the history of medicine belonged to everyone it had touched. Not only the people it had honored. Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid was published in 2006. It traced the use of black bodies in American medical research. Across more than 200 years, it named names. It cited records. It refused to let the history be tidy. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction. It should be required reading in every medical school in the country. In most of them, it is not. Deirdre Cooper Owens published Medical Bondage in 2017. Her work placed Sims in his full historical context, not as a lone genius, but as a product of the slave economy, a man whose access to experimental subjects was made possible by the legal and social infrastructure of human bondage. His discovery, she argued, cannot be separated from its origins. To honor the discovery without acknowledging the origins is to participate in the same erasure. These arguments reached the public. In 2017, a coalition of activists, physicians, ethicists, and historians formally petitioned the city of New York to remove the statue of J. Marion Sims from Central Park. The petition argued that a public monument is a public statement, and that the statement made by honoring Sims in that park, without any acknowledgement of Anarcha, Betsey, Lucy, and the others, was a statement about whose lives mattered, whose contributions counted, and whose suffering was worth remembering. The opposition was fierce and immediate. Some argued that Sims was a man of his time, that judging 19th century behavior by 21st century standards was anachronistic, that he should be understood within his historical context. But the women were also of his time. Anarcha was of his time. Lucy was of his time. Betsey was of his time. They lived in the same moment, the same year, the same shed, and they were treated differently, not because of the era, because of their race. Others argued that removing the statue was erasing history. But whose history had been preserved? His name was on the statue. His face was in bronze. His achievement was inscribed for anyone who passed by to read. And the women whose bodies made that achievement possible were not mentioned anywhere. Not in the park, not on the plaque, nowhere. Which erasure exactly were they afraid of? On April 17, 2018, the city of New York removed the statue of J. Marion Sims from Central Park. It was transported to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, placed near his grave, where it remains today, a monument contextualized by proximity to death, no longer occupying a position of public honor in one of the most visited parks in the world. Artist and activist Michelle Browder, based in Montgomery, Alabama, has been working for years to erect a permanent monument to Anarcha in Central Park. She created a statue of Anarcha. She leads walking tours of the Montgomery sites connected to the experiments. She speaks the names of the women at every opportunity. She has said in interviews that her work will not be finished until Anarcha's name is in that park, in stone, permanent. As of this writing, no such monument exists. The temptation at the end of a story like this is closure. To say that was then, we are different now. To say the statue came down, the reckoning happened, we move forward. But the data does not allow closure. In 2016, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published a report on pregnancy-related mortality in the United States. Black women in America die from pregnancy-related complications at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women. 3 to 4 times, not in 1845. Now, in the era of modern obstetrics, in the era of hospital births and ultrasound machines and epidurals, 3 to 4 times. The reasons are not mysterious. Researchers have studied them carefully. They include systemic inequities in access to care. They include the physical toll of chronic stress, what researchers call weathering, the biological damage done to the body by a lifetime of navigating racism. They include the persistence of the same beliefs that James Marion Sims carried into his shed in 1845. In 2016, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences surveyed medical students and residents at a major American university. It asked them to respond to statements about biological differences between racial groups. Statements like, "Black people's skin is thicker than white people's skin. Black people have less sensitive nerve endings than white people. Black people have a higher pain threshold than white people." These statements are false. Every one of them. There is no scientific basis for any of them. They are the same lies that appeared in 19th century textbooks. The same lies that allowed Sims to operate without anesthesia. And in 2016, a significant proportion of medical students and residents in the United States endorsed them. The study found that the medical students who held these beliefs were also significantly more likely to underestimate pain in black patients and to recommend less pain medication for them. The line from Anarcha's shed to this study is not a metaphor. It is a direct, documented, measurable line. In 2018, the same year the Sims statue came down, Serena Williams gave birth to her daughter in a Florida hospital. The day after the birth, she developed symptoms she recognized immediately. She had experienced pulmonary embolism before. She knew what it felt like. She told the nurse. The nurse did not respond with urgency. She escalated. She had to push, insistently, forcefully, repeatedly, before the medical team took her concern seriously, before they ran the scan, before they found the clots in her lungs, before they gave her the treatment that saved her life. Serena Williams, one of the most accomplished athletes in human history, one of the wealthiest and most recognizable women in the world, with the resources to afford the best care, with the confidence and the voice to advocate for herself. And she still had to fight to be believed. She said in an interview afterward that she felt unheard, that she felt dismissed, that she felt like she had to prove her own pain was real. That feeling has a history. It is old. It has a name, and the name of the shed where it was institutionalized into American medicine is Montgomery, Alabama, 1845. This is not only a story about the past. The past is not past. The past is the room we are still standing in. But there are people working to change the room. Michelle Browder in Montgomery, Deirdre Cooper Owens in her scholarship, Harriet Washington in her writing, the physicians and nurses and medical educators who are incorporating this history into their training, who are saying clearly to the next generation, here is where we came from. Here is what was done. Here is what it costs when we forget. There are efforts to rename the Sims speculum, to add Anarcha's name to the curriculum, to build a formal acknowledgement into the institutions that have benefited from what was taken from her. These are not small things. They are reparations of a kind. Not material, moral. A statement that says, we know what happened. We say it out loud. We say her name. Anarcha was 17 years old when she first entered that shed. She had just lost a child. She was leaking urine without control. She was 17, and she was alone in the hands of a man who had decided that her pain was an acceptable cost. She endured 30 operations without anesthesia. 30. Over 4 years, in a wooden shed, without her consent, without her name in the paper he published afterward, without a monument, without a grave marker we can find, without a single word in any surviving record that tells us what she thought or felt or believed about any of it. She survived something that should not have happened to her. She survived something that the world chose to celebrate, with bronze and stone and a century of silence about what it cost. We do not know where her body is buried. We do not know if anyone held her hand when she died. We do not know if her name was spoken at the end. We do not know if anyone wept for her. We do not know if she had children who remembered her, or grandchildren who kept her alive in story. What we know is what she endured. And we know her name, Anarcha. We know her name, Betsey, Lucy, and all those whose names the record refused to keep. The statue came down. Their names remain. And if you leave this video carrying something, let it be that. Not the name of the man, the name of the women the world built its medicine on. The women the world then chose to forget. The women who are not forgotten. Not anymore. Anarcha, Betsey, Lucy, and all those whose names were never written down.